Oh boy, it's here. We're back looking at Led Zeppelin today, everybody. Welcome back to the DiscogLog, the show where we look at famous bands and we rank all their albums up against each other. Today is the special day. We are doing Led Zeppelin. Of course, November is really Zeppelin month. If you think about it, they had 2 albums come out in this month back in the day. And of course, we're going to be ranking those today. We got some big notes here. I think I have 5.5 pages. Anyway, first thing is first, there's not going to be any sound samples of the music in this video like there was in the Alice in Chains DiscogLog because my video will get blocked probably. Because whoever owns the rights to Led Zeppelin currently is notorious for doing that. So we're not going to get any sound samples today, but that's not going to stop us. We're here. You can see the tier list right here. We're going to start with the Led Zeppelin debut album here. So let's start with what's good about this. We got well done vocals. They're pretty clear. Good delay and reverb on them. Of course, Robert does a great job with his delivery. You can usually always hear him. And acoustic guitars sound really great. That's something Led Zeppelin's always had, really good acoustic guitars. The electric guitars sound pretty well recorded. Pretty nice, pretty clean. John plays good rock parts, you know. They're what they need to be, good rock and blues stuff. Pretty straightforward, as you would expect from him. And then I would like to talk more about the bass, but Dazed and Confused is really the only song that gives you bass on this album. Unfortunately, you don't hear the bass very well on it. That's kind of a big problem when a quarter of your band is hard to hear. We don't really want that to be the case. And then this, of course, starts the litany of bad things we're going to talk about with Led Zeppelin 1. First of all, Jimmy, we love him. But it's like on this, he has a tendency to overplay quite a lot. It's just not great. There's a lot of moments that are just filled with a flurry of different guitar things happening and they get kind of sloppy and all this. I think that's just left over from his Yardbird days, you know, when you would just play blues licks and play as many of them as you can. And the unfortunate thing it leads to is him not serving the songs the best that he could all the time. And then the worst thing, the most glaring thing is the drum recording, and the drum mix on this is not good. You know, the snare is okay, but you know, it's missing a little beef to it. There's not great high-end information on it. The kick is horrible because it's got this really bad like sound that sounds like it's peaking the mic. I don't know if it's that or if it's just the frequency is really unpleasant. Now, some of this we can point to the limitations of how you could record drums back then, is some of it. But there's just really a really bad frequency in that kick drum that you don't get from the other albums, and it's really hard to listen to. Unfortunate. And of course, when we do get to hear John Paul, we do get good organ playing from him because he can play keyboards, piano too, so it's pretty great. And you do get good organ parts from him on this album, which is the one positive thing. And the last thing is there's not a lot of original material. I think there is one song that was original on Led Zeppelin 1, possibly 2. I don't remember quite for sure. But there's not a lot of original material on this. The whole album is basically blues covers, which is fine. A lot of bands did that back then. I understand that. But we're talking about Led Zeppelin here, and that's kind of a weak point that there's no original material on this when, of course, later they were writing very prolifically. Kind of a low point there, but again, left over from Jimmy Page being in the Yardbirds, I think, personally, where that was pretty common. What you did as a blues band is you just covered other blues songs. And that's what he thought Led Zeppelin was just going to be, I think, when they started this, which is why the debut album is like this. So overall, we're talking solid album, very innovative, does some cool things, but it's very raw. There's a lot of mixing issues, I think, that exist with this. Jimmy playing too much, a few different things, and that's going to start us off on a B tier with Led Zeppelin 1. Next, right, we're going to Led Zeppelin II, of course. Next album came out in the same year in 1969 as Led Zeppelin 1. And of course, the first thing is we get original material. Most of this is original material. There are 3 songs, I believe, that are not, but that's fine. They're writing stuff now, which is a very good thing to see. Using a lot more effects, a lot more varieties of tone across the different instruments here, which is showing growth with the band. Mixing has improved overall. Drums still have the same problem from the last album, unfortunately. Get more bass, though, so that's been corrected here. And Robert Plant, of course, starts expanding his vocal style a little bit more, moving out of that pretty strict blues type of sound into some different kinds of vocals, more psychedelic stuff, maybe more pop kind of things like that. And we get a lot of versatility out of John. There are multiple types of percussion instruments on this album that he plays. And he does a very good job, does a good job of changing up some of his rhythms a little bit so they're not just the same basic blues style drumming that we get in the first album. And then Jimmy Page and Eddie Kramer working together with production and how they mix this one, being very dynamic with the console, doing lots of different things with that to affect the overall sound of this album, which is a new thing, utilizing the console in almost a way as another additional instrument. And overall, this album just has more clarity to it than the last one, a little bit less raw, a little bit more polished. Showing growth is a very important thing here. Again, a good acoustic guitar sound, very good. Like I said, Led Zeppelin does a good job with that every time. A few negatives with this. Again, the drum issue has not been corrected that I talked about. Robert Plant's lyric writing is gets kind of derivative. Very typical type of blues and rock writing, of course, but when you have several lines that just consist of yeah, ooh, and baby, and man, come on, write some words, please. I know a lot of that is ad-libs, but we cannot have whole lines and sections that are just words like that don't really mean anything. Need something a little better there, Robert. And then, of course, Moby Dick is a drum showcase, which is fine. It's fine if you like it. It has a really good riff in it that Jimmy Page came up with. But it's just a drum showcase. That's kind of boring, honestly. It's not boring. It's just like, that's all it is. And I kind of wish that slot went to a song, really, instead. And of course, I forgot about this. My last note is Plant harmonica. Of course, Robert Plant can play the harmonica, which is something I didn't know prior to doing research for this. So that's very cool, and it's very good in there. But again, we're still keeping it in the B tier. Mostly because the last few things I talked about, the drum issue, Moby Dick is a weird song, and Robert Plant's lyric writing is kind of blah. So, and that's it. That's a B tier. Next one up on this, we've got Led Zeppelin III. Oh boy, I love counting. Okay, we get an even more improved bass sound and bass mixing on this than we had in the last albums. You can actually hear the bass with everything else, and we're not just waiting for points in songs where we can pick it out. Like, it's there. Very good. We have solved the drum issue in here. That horrific, biting, nasty kick sound that was in the last 2 albums is gone. Snare sounds better too. Get a little bit more beef. This album shows a lot of more range with the band incorporating more psychedelic and folk elements here, getting into even more heavier style rock riffs on this album. So we're getting good variety of things, good dynamics between everything. Get a lot more instrument variety here. John Paul's doing a lot more compositional things, playing a lot more instruments. He's got strings on this he's playing. Again, acoustic, just it is what it is. It's always good with them. Don't know what it is about their acoustic sound. It's always really good. And we get a lot more experimentation with effects and different sounds in the mix and using different effects on guitars and things like that. Robert Plant is further expanding the stylistic variety of his delivery and his tone. Very nice to hear on this. And Jimmy Page has improved his playing. He is playing less and doing a better job of playing what needs to be played for these songs instead of just flinging around blues licks everywhere like a psycho. Get much more controlled guitar parts that are better written. Vocals sometimes are a little bit quiet in spots, because in the last two albums we get that big, bright, brash Robert Plant voice smacking us in the face, and sometimes on here he's a little quiet. There's a lot more acoustic instrument arranging on here. Acoustic guitar arrangements are very nice on this album. Sound really good. And of course, it's very important to point out, there are songs on this record that feel very far ahead of their time. It doesn't feel like we're in 1970. It sounds like we're off like in the 80s somewhere, or past that even, in some of these songs. There's never been a song like Immigrant Song on here before. Friends is pretty innovative. I know it's mostly acoustic, but it's just got a way different thing because it's got the orchestral strings, and then Robert Plant doing a way different vocal delivery than he would normally do, which is really cool. And then we get some stuff that does, way different things, like Since I've Been Loving You, bringing us, it's kind of blues, but he's kind of gone in a little bit more soul direction with how he sings on this one. And then we get heavier things like Gallows Pole. That's great. Bronny R. Stomp, which is a way different song. That's a pretty cool one, though. I like that. It brings us that kind of folk dance kind of thing into this blues style. And of course, I have a main note on here that just says John Paul Jones is a freak, which he is. He can play a lot of instruments. He knows how to arrange. He knows how to compose. Like, he can do so much. He was so talented, and he gets talked about the least. It's kind of sad, considering the man was probably the most talented musician in the band. That could be a controversial statement, but I do firmly believe that is the case. So overall, it's a fun, playful album that shows a lot of growth with the band. It has the best mix so far, and it's a good blend of all the genres that we've talked about. So this guy is going to get the A tier spot here. And of course, we're going to move on to the big one, Mr. 4 right here, the fourth album, or just the symbols. And then we are on to the big one, the big 4 in the catalog, the fourth album, or just Untitled, or flash the 4 symbols up. And there it is. Doesn't really have a title. Everyone calls it Led Zeppelin IV, but, they decided to be funny, and just Jimmy Page thought it would be funny to not include any information on the album and just put symbols as the title, and there we go. Mostly because he was not happy with the critical reception and how people were talking about Led Zeppelin III, so he's like, let's just say nothing and put dumb symbols. Forgot to mention these last 2 albums engineered by Andrew Johns. Anyway, best drum mix again so far. It sounds really clean, really full, good punchy kick, but it's not annoying like the last ones were. It's a little bit quieter. It's not just this. Before, it kind of had this, kind of echoey wide sound, but the frequency is not very focused, so it was kind of, I guess, floppy is the word you could use. And on here it's a little bit tighter. Vocals are good, have really great volume on this. Variety of effects being used when they need to be. It's very effective in terms of the vocals. We get a huge variety of guitar sounds like we haven't had before. Page is bringing out some really good riffs on here. Really excellent playing. Letting the guitars do the talking, and he's not trying too hard, and he's not overplaying or doing any of that. John Bonham's bringing in even more styles. He's getting these really groovy parts, some of them, and he's changing up the beat sometimes so it doesn't sound 4 to the floor and all that. And I think there are times, may not be on this album, but he does change up the timing in some of his stuff later. So I think at a point they do start playing a little bit with the time signatures, but I don't think that's an intentional thing. I think that's more just a feel let's do something different type of thing. Again, Robert Plant's playing with the delivery of his vocals and the style, and playing with the pacing way differently, like he does on Stairway to Heaven, when we have those soft, slower parts in the beginning, and when the rest of the instruments hit and it gets into the heavy section, it totally changes the delivery. It's not so slow, it's not whispery, it's very powerful. Of course, John Paul showing off his multi-instrumentalism. He's playing a lot of instruments on this record, and it's really great. Love to see it. There's a lot more creative parts and creative arranging moves on this album that were not in the previous ones that are really good. And Stairway to Heaven is a good example because it's an 8-minute song that they managed to keep from being boring, which with a song that long is very hard to do. And they do a good job of this because they keep changing the arrangements, bringing in different parts. You know, the song kind of stacks different parts. So it starts with the acoustic guitars and the soft voice, and then we get a clean guitar and things. We get the drums, bass, then we get more guitars stacked on that when we get to the heavier section. Plant doubling his voice, all these different things building on each other. Solo happens at the perfect spot because we're not fully climaxed yet. We get to there a little bit after the solo, and then we wind down, and then it's just a well-paced song. It's very hard to make a long song not just be boring or chore to listen to. We do get some guest musicians on here, just a couple of guys. Guest pianist, I think, and a guest vocalist. There's some very high quality guitar solos on this that are well thought out. It's not just Jimmy taking the guitar and, you know, blasting his way through a bunch of licks and all that. It sounds way more thought out than the past. And like I talked about, good arrangements with building the songs up in various sections in various ways to keep them interesting. And I made the comment about the drums earlier. The drums are very beefy on this, very big, and it sounds great. They do a little bit better job, I think, with blending styles. Led Zeppelin III is good with that, but it had a little bit too much folk happening, so they kind of got a little bit away from that really good rock sound. You know, Led Zeppelin IV has a bunch of great riffs on it, so they get back into that while still keeping some of the acoustic guitar, some of the folk elements. And so talking about all that, it gets oversaid probably, but this is the best album they did. You know, it has to go to S tier. Best thing they ever did. But anyway, we're still going to talk about the rest of them and figure out where they stack up. We've got Houses of the Holy, which is one of the weirdest albums out here. Eddie Kramer is back for mixing and engineering, and we like the results we get with Eddie. I mean, a lot of people do. Eddie's incredible. That guy's a legend. And we got brighter guitar tone, experimenting with sounds, and it's not quite as effective as it was in some other spots because that guitar tone can be a little weird sometimes. And sometimes it's too bright, too grating. Sometimes guitars don't feel as big as they should. And the things with the first track on the song remains the same. They did some weird choices with the vocals, speeding them up, and like, ew. It just felt kind of gross. The song was originally written as an instrumental. It probably should have stayed that way because the vocals, they did weird things, and they were kind of, lyrics kind of felt like an afterthought on this. So this, as far as opening tracks go, not off to a good start on this album, in my opinion. But we're getting good bass composition, good bass sounds, of course, because John Paul is really great. We're back with the good acoustic sounds. I should probably just stop mentioning them entirely because they don't matter because they're so good. Style experimentation, all that. This has like a really great orchestral kind of cinematic feel almost to it, which is a pretty cool direction to go in at the time they were at with 1973 here. Robert's lyricism, even though the first song is weird for vocals and things, his lyrics on the rest of this are very good. He's doing a much better job with writing lyrics and bringing in different ideas and metaphors and kind of painting a better picture of things than before. The drums are a little bit too quiet on here. I have a note that says they feel like they're fighting the mix too much to be heard, because you don't ever want to have that feeling. You want it to be there, but you don't want it to be difficult to hear or feel in the final mix. We get a lot of use with the Mellotron on here from John Paul experimenting with that. Does some really good parts on that. Really like that. John experimenting on the drums more, doing some more weird beats, some kind of odd time signature stuff. Just a little bit. It's not a ton on here. It's not noticeable. It's not like there's a lot of other bands that do a ton of that. They didn't really do a ton of time signature changes, but they do some on this album. There are some other weak points in the lyric writings with the "oh yeah baby" problem again with Robert, but you know, I think the quality of the rest of them make up for it on this album. And of course, we have JP showing off his compositional skills. Like I said, does a really good job on his writing on this. No Quarter is a song again that feels like it's a little bit ahead of its time. It's really great that they keep pushing the envelope here just a little bit more, so they stay interesting. Robert does sound a little too bright sometimes on here. He's staying up in that really high register a lot. Can be a little bit grating sometimes. It's not the smoothest vocals on a Led Zeppelin album. They got some long stuff on here. There are sections of the longer songs that do get a little bit boring. Didn't have that issue on Led Zeppelin IV. And then, of course, there's a lot of stylistic variety, but it feels like they're kind of jumping around with stuff a little too much, which is fine. It's interesting, but like you do want the album to be a little bit focused and concise. You don't want it jumping around to too many places or everything just feels like it's disconnected and shouldn't be together on the album. But I mean, this is still a high quality album that we're looking at here. Still very good. I like all the experimentation they've done. So it's still gonna get an A tier, despite some of the negatives I talked about, because I mean it's a better progression than Led Zeppelin III is. There were some weak spots on Led Zeppelin III that aren't on this album, but again, it does have its own issues, so we're gonna get the A tier on this one. All right, next, Mr. Physical Graffiti down here with the experimental die cut album cover. Very cool. I'm hoping my camera battery does not die before we get through all of these, but it may. Anyway, let's get to it here. Got a good typical hard rock opening from the boys here, which is what we like to hear coming after what happened on Houses of the Holy. Really great guitar sounds on this, and there's more experimentation with gear and different kinds of effects on here that Jimmy does very nicely. Really good lyricism on this album too. This might have some of the best lyrics on the album, from Robert Plant, although again vocals are still a little bit quiet. Sometimes they're a little bit unclear. They're not as forward and in your face as you would like them to be, but we get good things. We get more compositional involvement from John Bonham, which is cool to see here. Jimmy has very good playing on these songs here, very tasteful stuff, no overplaying. Well-written parts that feel like they were made specifically for the job they do. And John Paul is playing another instrument on here. He's playing the clavinet, and he is a monster on that thing. He has some really great licks, really good parts. One of the songs, I don't remember which one, has him soloing on it, and it's very good. And of course, John Paul has a much bigger involvement with the overall composition of the songs on this. He's really good at composing and arranging. Probably was the best at it in the band. He comes up with some really cool stuff that gives, again, that kind of epic orchestral feel while still maintaining that usual rock sound that you expect from them. And of course, the band keeps experimenting with unique sounds on this, being more progressive with things, using exotic scales, changing up the time signatures in different spots. And we get into some more of the negative stuff here. Robert's voice changing a lot in volume and style across this album because they are using some of these tracks were recorded previously other times, so sometimes everything does not track and fit together as well, and the volume of his voice changes between different songs, which isn't ideal to have. Sometimes it gets a bit annoying, and it just feels like there's a lot of songs on here because we're jumping from this orchestral experimental sound, cool stuff, back to really simple blues rock things, back to this thing, back to this other thing. Because again, I said there's older tracks that they've put on here that maybe didn't need to be here because they did make this a double album. And then we come back to the issue of back-to-back 8+ minute songs that do have kind of slower tempos. Not a great move in my opinion. That's kind of boring. In My Time of Dying is just too long period. That's 11 minutes. I don't know why it has to be 11 minutes. you can edit that down, guys. And then having the difference with the mixes, again, that affects the drums too, because we go to them being kind of quiet, not as good, to being better, and then back to quiet. And there's just too many inconsistencies between things on here. If that stuff wasn't happening, this album could have been an S tier, honestly, with where they were going with it. But unfortunately, it's going to be stuck in an A tier. Unfortunate, because they were doing really cool stuff on this that I liked. Oh well, when you put older songs on, sometimes they don't hit as well as everything else, or things don't sequence or fit together as well. You just cannot have an 11-minute song and then also on the album have two back-to-back 8.5-minute songs. That's just really poor management of the sequencing and just bad editing of the songs. But it's fine. It still sounds really good, so it's A tier. All right, Presence. We're going to the weirdest album out here because of kind of everything that surrounded it. You know, Robert was in a bad car accident, stuck in a wheelchair for a while, had to perform the vocals like that. You know, Jimmy Page came out to write with him and then decided, well, let's just do an album, and decided to book the recording time then and try to do it all while they were in Malibu, California, which before the Rolling Stones got into the studio they were going to use. Actually had to convince them to let him borrow some of their time so he could do guitar overdubs. Everything was rushed, put together so fast on this. They should have just waited until Robert Plant had recovered from his accident to try to record this. And he said apparently that he was kind of unhappy that Jimmy had booked the studio time because he really didn't feel like recording the album at that time. It didn't leave a lot of room for the complex arranging. Everything was just really straightforward and tear down from where we were. The accident did, I think, notice, and the fact he had to sit down in the wheelchair and do the vocals did noticeably affect it. He wasn't getting as good of a range. Sometimes he sounds a little sloppy, which he did not sound like that before, and I think that's the accident, which is why I say they should have waited. Achilles' Last Stand is a cool song, but 10.5 minutes. It's a little bit long-winded. There are parts that could have been edited down. This album is a guitarist's dream, and that is the best thing it does. Because everything else is boring and uninteresting. The vocals don't sound that great, really. I mean, the guitars are cool. Again, the arrangements just are, there's not a lot happening. John Paul's playing no keyboards on this because they didn't have time to arrange any of that stuff. John is just coming in, laying down the parts. And even the other songs that aren't as long could have still also been edited at points because sometimes it feels like the guitar parts and things drag on too much. You hear me speeding this up because I don't know when the camera's going to die on me or not. And again, it's incredibly repetitive, incredibly derivative, basic rock that has almost nothing else going on except a few points where the guitars are good. There is no acoustic guitars, and we talked about how good those are and what a shame it is they didn't put it on here. And that's really all I have to talk about. I didn't have many notes on this. There was just not a lot to say because it's not good. And this might be incredibly controversial, and some people I know are not going to like this, but when we come from the build from Led Zeppelin to Led Zeppelin 3 to 4, Houses of the Holy doing weird stuff that it does, experimental, physical graffiti, doing all the cool compositional things, all this different stuff, to just all of that gone, that's pretty jarring, and that's pretty sad, and they're capable of a lot more. If they had just waited to do it, it would have been so much better, I think. But they didn't, so this is going to get very harshly the C tier. It's just, when you compare it to what they did before that, to come out with Presence is just not, it's not it, man. All right, we're coming back a little bit. In Through the Outdoor, everybody. All right, In Through the Outdoor, we go back to Wide Experimental Sounds. In the very beginning of the album, we are opening with that kind of sound. Very cool. We like that. JP has a new Yamaha synth, and he uses that all over the place on this, and he does a great job because that man is a genius at arranging keyboard parts, and he's getting featured a ton on this. Lots of piano parts and keyboard parts in multiple styles. Really fantastic. They're continuing to push the stylistic envelope so they can stay relevant on this because, well, they're not being rushed this time, so they were able to take their time on that. There's really good changes. Carousel Alhambra is 10.5 minutes, but they have good changes, so I think it comes out better than Achilles' Last Stand did. John Bonham's delivering quality parts despite his alcohol addiction. He's still coming out and doing the job he needs to do, and it's great. When we get to Fool in the Rain, him doing that like Latin samba beat, that is really fantastic. And I'm surprised a guy that's an alcoholic could do that. Quite frankly. Robert Plant is back to better form, of course, being healed from his car accident, which happened quite a while before this album, of course, but he's back to his normal form, more range, more precision, but sometimes he does feel too far back in the mix, and he's quiet and hard to hear, disappointingly. The drum sound is very good. Page's parts are good for the songs, but he's not doing very much on this because Robert Plant and John Paul did most of the compositional work on this album, which is something that was very new for the band, to not have Jimmy be that involved. But most of what they pull off is pretty good, but Hot Dog is a horrible song that shouldn't exist. I'm Gonna Crawl could do better. There's just not a lot going on in that song, especially with the lyrics. And I feel like for as basic of a blues song that is, it's too long, even at 5.5 minutes. And like I said, there is a lot of good things I'm saying on this. That's because we're coming off of Presence. So it makes this album sound way better. But, I mean, there's not a lot they really expanded on from the past on this. Like, there are some good songs. Fool in the Rain is a good song. All of My Love is a good song. The rest of this album is just kind of, here it is. Here's some basic stuff for you. There's just not enough going on for me in this album. There's way less going on than there is in, 3 Houses of the Holy and Physical Graffiti. And even with 2 is just innovative because of when it came out and what they did. So give it the respect, because this is not innovating that much really. It's going to end up being a B tier. We're going real quick here. I am about to lose this camera battery. Oh my god. How quick can I go through? Alright, stuff is good. Stuff is cool. There's good overdubs on the live tracks and all of that stuff. Good Plant vocals here. Very nice. Page's tendency to overplay does come up because they did put some old recordings on this. Despite the hodgepodge, like I said here in my note, it doesn't feel too disconnected. Most of the songs do fit together pretty well because it's good rock stuff. John Bonham gets a feature on this because there's a song that's a tribute to him. This came out after he had passed away, but it is still a drum showcase, and I don't like those really typically that much because they don't really feel like songs. Good classic songs. The final track could have been better if they put it on an earlier record instead of just by itself on this. Lyrics are generic because, again, some of the older stuff, so there's some disconnects between the older stuff and the newer stuff. I still think it's a pretty decent album. So pause this for a second. There was one thing about CODA while we're on it right now that I forgot to add because I was trying to get out of here before my camera died. But anyway, real quick, there were a lot of outtakes from other albums on this record. And the problem with that, with outtakes, is it can often be pretty clear as to why they were outtakes and didn't make it on the album. So overall, while CODA is a good gesture and a good thing to, send all the old stuff out since they weren't together anymore after John died, there's still outtakes and they still make this album weak. So there's some justification for that. Back to the video. Though, did it need to be made? Not necessarily. Still pretty good. I'm trying to get through this quick because the camera battery is about to die, so I can't say a whole lot on this. I mean, it's good overall classic Led Zeppelin, but it's a little bit too derivative. It's almost too classic. And with that, we're going to drop it in the B tier really quick before the camera dies. I hope you guys enjoyed the Led Zeppelin DiscogLog. Like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment down below if you like. Tell me what you think about the albums and what your order would be. Hit the bell to get notifications for when new videos are out. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope I will see you again for another video. Goodbye.